Hello. So on this episode of the Leadership Zone, I'm talking about the unintended consequence of leadership development and how it can create idealism and fantasies around organizations more than we intend for it to. So let me rewind and tell you why this matters. So a lot of the time when we're talking about leadership development and you're trying to support leaders in developing, we are always aiming for best practice, best case scenario, and so on, which can then lead leaders to think about themselves in a negative way, and it can also lead leaders to tell me about all the ways the organization is imperfect. And it's true, organizations are imperfect. Systems of people who are perfectly imperfect, who come from different backgrounds, have different experiences, have different values, see the world in different ways, mean that the processes and procedures that are involved in organizational systems will have personality attached to them and will have decisions that aren't always made from data or are made from data, and they bias the data instead of the human experience. Or people think they're made from data and they're really made from feelings, and those feelings may or may not be biased. So why this is important is that in OD work, so organizational development, and in a lot of leadership development, there's a lot of talk about best practice. There's a lot of talk about how you can make things work better and be more effective. And what this can lead to is an eye on all of the imperfections that exist within your organization. And sometimes it gives leaders and people an opportunity to show that it's not them, it's the other. And that's a bias we all have when it's like a human bias othering. When we associate something with something negative, it's more comfortable in the initial reaction to point to something else than it is to say, oh, I experience that too, or I do that too. So we tend to like to look for flaws in others and not in ourselves because it's kind of better for our ego. And that's perfectly normal and natural, and we don't need to judge it. But what we do need to do is be careful about when we're believing it. So there is no perfect system or organization out there. Let's start with that. That doesn't mean we don't need to aim for better organizations and systems. That doesn't mean we say, oh, we don't bother. It's a bit like the difference between completing something and something being part of the process. So you can have a shower and complete the shower, but that doesn't mean you'll never need to shower again. That's kind of the difference between completing the task today and knowing that the task is still part of the process moving forward. And in organizations, and especially in regards to leadership, that's a really central piece to leading, is the ability to lead within the imperfect realities we exist and to lead imperfectly. Because we don't just need a leader, like a perfect leader, we need a leader. We need people who are thinking on behalf of the organization, who are making key decisions, who are influencing people, who are supporting people, who are bringing people along. They don't need to be perfect. And so if your confidence is coming from this notion of perfection, then you're going to struggle with leadership, because leadership is messy. Working in organizations is really messy. And that's the nature of people and systems. And that doesn't mean we don't aim for best practice. And it doesn't mean we don't bring ourselves to the highest standard that we can as individual leaders, and in terms of ensuring our system is better, it's more inclusive, it's more sustainable, it's more profitable. All of those things are valuable things in a private organization. In other organizations, like public organizations or not-for-profit, maybe the profit isn't so important, but there's still a kind of an additional stakeholder involved rather than the profit being a measure of success. And so we really need to think about the fantasies, and this is like from Klein's work, Melanie Klein's work, fantasies being a PH rather than F for fantasy. The fantasies we have about the perfect organization, the perfect managers, the perfect leaders, the perfect children, the perfect people. And we need to start to say, well, actually, if this is the reality, I have to make choices about this reality. If this is the reality, do I stay here and get frustrated with it and then pass that frustration on to others? If this is the reality, can I find a way to move through frustration into acceptance of it? Does that feel reasonable for me? if this is the reality, is it something I can't bear because I think is harmful or traumatic or unhelpful to me as a person, or that the system itself is harmful and I don't wish to be part of it? Do I leave? If I leave, do I follow up and complain? Like, we have loads of choices about reality and the reality of the organizations we work in. But what we often do is think about the fantasy of what it should and could be. And we don't necessarily work with the reality of how we are contributing to both the solution and often the problem as well, just as people in systems. So what I want us to think about is our relationship with reality and the reality of our work. And if that reality in us, you, me, are having a reaction to it, how do we own that and make some good decisions with that? So what I often talk about when I talk about accepting something, I'm not talking about liking it or embracing it. I'm talking about acknowledging it for what it is. So I accept that my organization is deeply flawed, or my organization does these things badly, or my organization, whatever. Or I accept that my manager, leader, boss, client has these expectations of me, and the reality is I can't or won't or don't want to meet them. Or I accept that somebody behaves this way, meaning I acknowledge that they behave this way, and I now need to accept that that is the reality. They behave this way, and I need to accept that so that then I can move into choices. And the choices I have are, what do I want to do with this reality? Whereas a lot of the time, what we tend to do, because we don't want to work with the reality of the situation and the feelings that it brings up for us, is we create fantasies around how it should be. And that kind of feeds into some blame and shame of other people and the organization, but also a distancing where we distance ourselves from that reality. But if you work for an organization that you're deeply frustrated about, which loads of us do at different points, and it fluctuates, hopefully it fluctuates. For some people, if you're working with an organization that frustrates you, the question is, how are you relating to that frustration and your expectations and your fantasies about the organization? And what role do you want the organization to play in your life? Because you're fighting with something rather than working through the feelings and making a decision. And look, the same can be said for how we relate to people and relationships as well. That initial rejection or denial of something that is happening, that blame and shame, is a way to avoid making choices. And the reality is organizations are flawed. You're flawed, I'm flawed, we're all flawed. And that's not actually the problem. The problem is our relationship with the flaws. Our problem is our relationship with the realities we're facing, and that some of us stay in places and resent them while staying there. And others don't stay long enough that they move away from any discomfort, anything they dislike in the organization, and they don't move through the feelings associated with it so that they can make new choices. So all of us naturally default when we're interacting with systems and groups and our emotional experience. And so it's really important to understand how reality is impacting the way we feel, and then how we cope with how we feel, because that's where most of our control and power can actually come from. It's not whether the organization is deeply flawed or not, but it's our relationship with those flaws. And for some of us, we can stay in places that others can't, and in other places we can't stay, and we can't believe others can. So it's not, instead of making an organization good or bad, or a manager good or bad, and this is outside of cases of abuse and bullying. I'm not talking about that overt, unacceptable behavior. I'm talking about the stuff you wish was better, but just isn't, and you mull over, and you reject the organization over, and you reject the person over, but you don't really work with the reality of that you're facing, the reality that this is the organization, that this is your manager. And then you don't, from that reality, you're not working with actually your choices in the situation. So often people tell me how they're stuck. And when we investigate how they're stuck, they're not actually stuck because they don't have choices. They're often stuck because they don't like their options, and they resent having to make a choice. And that's perfectly okay. That's perfectly reasonable. But it's still important that we're acknowledging the reality of our experiences rather than the fantasies of what we think they should be. And that allows us to have more choices. And whenever we have more choices, whenever we take responsibility for the choices we're making, we're going to find that we feel better. That's the starting point. We will feel like we have more autonomy and more control over our lives. And we do when we're focused on our options, even if they're options we dislike. But the other piece is if you're in a leadership position and you aren't taking into account your frustrations and your experiences, and you aren't taking into account how you may be storing them, gathering them, building resentment, but not acting on your own autonomy, not making choices that give you the results you want, then you're going to more than likely pass that on. And you may become part of the problem where your group or your team start to reject the identity of the organization, which means ultimately they can't align themselves with the purpose of the organization or the work that you're aiming towards, because there's a kind of inherent rejection of the organization due to it not being what people think it should be. Now, that is not talking about blatant, how would I say it? Like harm being done. I'm not talking about on a factory floor, health and safety not being taken seriously. But even if that is the case, the question is, what do you do about it? Because that's your choice. You always have the choice about what you do about it. But I'm talking more about those processes and procedures, those relational things that happen at work that aren't necessarily malice or harmful directly, but are frustrating and upsetting and annoying and irritating. And the question is, what do we do when we're frustrated, annoyed, irritated? And what we do has a direct impact on how we relate to people that report into us or people that we are senior to within the organizational structure. So it is important that we don't just go around being frustrated and annoyed, but that we think about how that's impacting how we lead and influence others. And also that we think about our role in other people's frustration with the organization. I work with lots of organizations, and like sometimes in training sessions, by the time you've gone through an organization, you could have done a couple of hundred people in a particular session. And one of the things I have found is that in an organization, I might hear a good bit about what's wrong. Like I just hear a lot about what's wrong. But everyone in the room that's telling me about what's wrong is saying somebody else does it, not them, like obviously not them, somebody else. And that's just not statistically accurate. It's not possible that your organization could be functioning that way or could be that frustrating and that nobody is contributing to that and that you're not on some level contributing to that. So in systems, it's very easy for us to be fixated on how it should be. And I do the same, I get that. But also we have a responsibility to think about the reality of the organization, the expectations we have of it and ourselves, and how we're going to work through that so that we can do our job, if we choose to stay, to the best of our ability, and not just do our job and then blame or resent the organization for its way of being. How do we acknowledge that it's frustrating? Because we don't want to ignore the feelings either, that it's frustrating without being consumed by the frustration and distracted by it. And for some of us, that's going to be about getting a coach. For others, it's going to be about going to therapy and talking about your feelings. For others, it's going to be about talking to someone who's going to mirror back to you, yeah, that must be annoying, and you have choices in the situation. For others, that's reading the right leadership book. Shout out to my leadership book club. You should definitely join. You can find it on the website under leader options. We have a really cool book club and we discuss leadership books, but we also bring it to life in our own leadership. So it's not just discussing the book, it's thinking about it in a reflective way. And so there are loads of ways that you can develop yourself so that you can manage those feelings and those fantasies. But when we don't, they manage us. And that's ultimately quite limiting for leaders, being managed by our fantasies of how things should be, rather than our vision of how we're going to make them, and the reality of how they actually are right now. That fantasy stuff gets in the way of lots of people. And that doesn't mean you won't have grief that the fantasy isn't what it should be. And it doesn't mean that you won't have feelings about it and judgments and, your ideals, and all of those things will be challenged in kind of coming to terms with the reality of what is and accepting it as the reality of an experience you're having right now. But that by accepting it, you have choices. Like, that's the work that we need to do if we want to work in imperfect organizations effectively without becoming burnt out or overly frustrated or resentful. And that's also what we need to work with when we're working with people who don't do things the way we do them, or we don't think do them good enough, or we don't think manage or lead us correctly. We need to bring ourselves back to the fantasy and the projections we're putting onto those people and ask if that's fair. If it's fair, you may need your manager or leader to behave differently. That's okay. But if they don't, then that's not fair on you to be fighting with yourself about what they should be that they're not, rather than the alternative behavior, which is to say, well, this is how they are. How am I going to choose to respond to that? And what choices do I have? It's not fair on you mostly to be living from a place of how things should be, rather than contributing and co-creating what you wish them to be, while also acknowledging the reality of how they really are right now. And that's a really important part of leadership, because if you're not managing that, you're really going to struggle to support other people moving through those realities. And you're going to find yourself cutting people off, getting disheartened, being distracted by frustration. And so it's really important to be able to hold that ourselves. And I think it's Anderson's work around leadership development, there's like 3 levels. There's skills, knowledge, and being. And this is the being level. This is like, how can you manage feelings of frustration and discontent, but also how are you going to hold that space so that other people can see it in you? Because if your direct reports are feeling frustrated and then they come to you and you're leaking frustration, you may actually end up enabling them and facilitating, colluding with them, for want of a better word, about how terrible the place is, which is just adding to concreting the issue rather than looking towards how to manage the issue and the choices everybody has in the setting. So that's it from me today. I'm going to leave you with that. This is actually, when I decided to record this episode, I was thinking to myself, this is a little bit hard, because when I even bring this up in my work with people, it's a bit confronting to say, actually, we're all walking around with fantasies about how people should be and who they should be, but also how organizations should be. And that sometimes the harm that's happening to us isn't how the organization is, which might be annoying or frustrating, but is actually our relationship with how we wish it was and the fantasy we have about it. So if you have any comments, there's links below, get on to me, be really interested in hearing from you. But also don't forget that my leadership letters go out every 2 weeks and they kind of discuss these core topics. So if you're wanting to stay up to date with leadership development and have kind of like a bite-sized piece of development every 2 weeks that you can utilize towards your own development and your own skills and your own knowledge and your own kind of sense of yourself and your leadership, then please do sign up for those bi-weekly emails, because they're really helpful to get you thinking and to be in conversation around some of these topics that often get overlooked in leadership development until you're at a more mature stage where actually continuing to do things the way you've always done them might not get you to the next level or help you progress your organization to where you want it to be. And that's the kind of stuff that I work with people on, is how do we support those barriers and support you to know what you need to do so that you can be more effective in your role as a leader, but also so you can influence and role model great behaviors for the people around you, and you can lead your organization forward in a way that is sustainable and inclusive. So if you have any questions, and you can always book a free consultation, do so, links are below. And besides that, I look forward to talking to you in the next episode.